A delight to be here with Professor Samuel Chaim Brody, who's an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Kansas. Thanks for taking time to talk.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about the fascinating subject of Hermann Cohen on repentance. So before we dive into teshuvah, the notion of repentance and his insights there, can you tell us a little bit, because I think a lot of folks won't know, who Hermann Cohen was?
Yes, thank you. Great question. So Cohen, who lived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was the first Jew to hold a philosophy chair in Germany during the period of the Second Empire. And he was really known as a philosopher. He founded a whole school in Marburg called Marburg Neo-Kantianism. And at the time, it was an extremely popular way to do philosophy. But he was also a teacher of a number of other Jewish thinkers like Rosenzweig and Buber, who all felt that they needed to relate themselves to him in some way, even though by the end of his life, he was really thought of as kind of old-fashioned, and for that reason, his popularity kind of dipped in the middle of the 20th century, only to be sort of revived by kind of modern Jewish thought specialists kind of towards the end of the century.
So it's a really big deal to be a teacher of Rosenzweig and Buber. When you say that, does that mean they took an elective with him, or does that mean they are really in some ways inheritors of his thought, or in the beginning at least?
The latter, I would say. So he helped run, he ran a kind of a Wissenschaft des Judentums adult education kind of school, really pioneering a version of Jewish studies that is still done today. And his latter work, more on Judaism itself as opposed to his earlier work, which is very generally philosophical, was just had a huge impact on those other thinkers. And they interpreted him in a way as their own precursor, which is something that many later Cohen scholars did not agree with and took pains to push back against, actually.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what are some of his unique insights on the repentance process? Yeah.
So Cohen actually sees tshuva as the core of monotheism, the core of Judaism itself.
Wow.
And one of the reasons for that is that he, in a kind of classic 19th century way, is very interested in drawing Athens-Jerusalem comparisons. And one of the things that he sees as a signature feature of Greek tragedy is the idea of fate. The idea that you live under some kind of doom that you cannot change, and that whatever your flaws are will undo you. And what he sees tshuva as bringing in is the idea that the things that the individual has done wrong do not determine their future, or they do not have to. That there is an escape from the fact that you have done something wrong. And that means that you have freedom. And in a sense, the possibility offered by tshuva is the possibility of freedom, and actually creates, in a way, the possibility of individuality. The very possibility of individuality.
Right. So freedom is really born not from throwing off moral weight, but is it precisely taking on more responsibility that brings freedom? And kind of, I think Levinas touches on that point as well in a different way.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And he really zooms in here on... He makes use of two main sources when he talks about this, because he wants to always root himself in sources. His main book where he talks about this is called The Religion of Reason, Out of the Sources of Judaism. So his first source is Ezekiel 18, which he comes back to again and again, and especially the line, "The soul that sins shall die," which is a polemic with some of earlier biblical texts that talk about how the sins of the parents will be transmitted to the children.
Yeah.
And he sees Ezekiel as focusing in on the individual and making it clear that the individual bears only the responsibility for what they do. Not that social sin goes away, but that there is a particular form of responsibility that you carry for what you did. And the other text that he often invokes is Yoma, where Rabbi Akiva talks about how happy Israel should be because it purifies itself before God, and the Holy One purifies them. And he sees this as, again, this is a classic 19th century progressive vision here. So what he sees Rabbi Akiva as doing is moving beyond the ancient notion that you need the priest to make expiation for you. He's very particular about the words that are used. So he notes, for example, that the rabbinic liturgy is always clear. It's always distinguishing between why is it salach lanu, mechal lanu, kaper lanu? Because these are all different things. So the priest used to do kaper alone, but now you do it, and God does it, and there's no mediator, and that's crucial for him as well.
Yeah. So there's this whole culture today of public apologies. Really, there's not a day you don't open the news and see a headline of someone apologizing for something they said or tweeted the day before. On the one hand, that feels a lot better than those who are so stiff-necked that they don't apologize for anything they do or say. On the other hand, it doesn't feel sufficient to demonstrate teshuvah.
Right.
And yet we don't know what's in their heart. So I wonder, how might you and or Cohen reflect on this culture today of what we do with this culture of public apologies?
Right, yeah, no. I'm glad you asked that. That is one of the reasons I thought this topic was interesting.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I think that a lot of people anyone who's gone to Hebrew school and learned about Yom Kippur and how it works, might be seeing echoes of this in a kind of secular discourse. For example, this critique that is out there now of the non-apology apology. You often see this, that even when someone apologizes, if you look closely, they're really saying, I'm sorry you felt that way.
Right.
And not, I'm sorry for what I did.
Right.
And so in the public secular discourse, there's this intense attention now to what makes an apology real and what makes it not. And so what I think, there's ways in which Cohen can contribute to this and ways in which he can't. One way that he can't, right, is that the role of God is really important. God is the one who forgives you in the end. Right. Just like you do need to, for interpersonal sins, you need to get forgiveness first from the person you offended. But eventually, you also want to know that God has forgiven you. And he says that's crucial because if you had ethics alone, for example, one of the achievements of Kant, who was a great inspiration to him, was supposed to have been, he founded ethics on a purely secular philosophical rationale, right? But if you have ethics alone, all you can ever do when you have failed is just know that you failed. There's a standard. I failed to meet it. I feel guilty. Bummer. I'll try to do better in the future, I guess, but bummer. And to get that clean slate, you kind of need God to actually forgive you. So the question there would be, is there a way that the public can agree, which is made up on people from all kinds of different backgrounds, Christians, Muslims, atheists, Jews, on some sort of standard of forgiveness that will allow us to say, you know what, you aren't doomed forever, but you have to show to the satisfaction of others that you feel remorse, right, that you confess that you know what you did wrong, right, and that you, in the same position again in the future, will not do the same thing again.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. So that's fascinating. So, in the modern Orthodox world where I did my studies, the only way you know Hermann Cohen is through Rabbi Soloveitchik, knowing that he, I believe, wrote his dissertation on his thought, and it's been suggested that his book on Teshuvah is also in some ways influenced by or has some parallels with Cohen's. Who are some of the other inheritors, 20th century inheritors of his thought, who build off it, and what are some developments where they steer away from as well?
So that's a great question. So one answer is Rosenzweig. Franz Rosenzweig, who, as I said earlier, had an interpretation of Cohen that argued that in the very, very end of his career, he became a Baal Tshuva, in a sense, that he turned away from his, bland neo-Kantian generic philosophy and really delved into Judaism. And a number of Cohen scholars, like Stephen Schwarzschild, have really pushed back against that and said, no, Cohen was informed by this the whole time. But what interested Rosenzweig about Cohen was precisely this pivotal place that he gave Judaism in terms of an existential grounding. And Buber, too, although the ways that they pushed back against Cohen involved this emphasis on experience and existence as opposed to this whole structure of reason that Cohen was very interested in. And so, particularly in one place, Cohen says, responds to that type of challenge. And, for example, he has this whole idea of God as an idea, God as a concept. And he imagines an interlocutor saying, how could you love a concept? How can you pray to a concept? And his answer is, how is it possible to love anything but an idea. He says, even in your interpersonal relationships, you always love an idea of a person. There's always something that you don't have access to, right? And so Buber was, in fact, very much pushed back against that. They want to believe in the real unmediated experience. But I think that there are a lot of other scholars who have really thought, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot we can use. And especially, I think, the fact that he sees in this really classical way, going back to Maimonides and Sadya, right? He sees himself as continuing that medieval rationalistic philosophical tradition, Judaism and reason, like that, no conflict.
That's one of the most interesting defenses of Maimonides' theology I've heard, actually, of how that could be theologically compelling at all, is actually that our relationships to people, in some ways, are relationships to ideas. So my last question for you, since you just came out with this exciting work last year, Martin Buber's Theopolitics, can you briefly just tell us about what you're doing there and what sort of inspired your engagement with that?
Sure, yeah. So the book is about the concept of theopolitics, which essentially Buber uses only in his writings on the Bible. And I try to argue that we should see this as one of Buber's main contributions, right up there with his work on Hasidism and his dialogical philosophy. And I think it really ties together all of his biblical writing in a way that, sometimes it's like you can see these writings that are kind of scattered around and they're just sort of materials for drashot, right? But they actually have this unifying concept, theopolitics, that ties them together, which is this idea that God didn't just give the Israelites a religion, he gave them a social order. He wanted them to constitute a social order, and their election of the Israelites was for the purpose of doing that. And to some extent, the story of the Bible, as Buber sees it, in terms of having one story, is the story of their attempt and failure to do that, followed by, at the very end, the beginning of a second chance. Right? And so he saw his own involvement in the Zionist movement as potentially the involvement in a third chance. But he also thought that was the only justification for Zionism. There was no secular justification that he could see. Either the Jews fulfill the election that they were called to fulfill, or they don't. And he didn't see that being possible in diaspora under the rule of regimes that would frustrate the ability of Jews to do anything collectively. But he also didn't see it as possible in Israel if the regime that was constituted there was going to frustrate the purposes of God's election.
Okay, so I lied. One last question then.
Okay.
And just because you started to touch on it. Everyone who's come out of college knows about Buber's dialogical philosophy, as you touched on. But not as many know how deeply engaged he was in societal work. I don't know if you know, today we'd call it an activism. But I wonder, how did that engagement, which was a significant part of his life, inform his thought?
That's a great question. I think part of what he believed very deeply was that the intellectual could not just exist above the fray. That you couldn't just sit in your office and write down your ideas and have nothing to do with politics. And this is something that linked Buber to Cohen as well, actually. They both believe very strongly that the role of ideas is to go into the fray and shape what's going on. Now, of course, when there's contact between the idea or the ideal and reality, the ideal gets messed up, first of all, which will cause some people to want to turn away from that effort because they'll see, oh, this didn't turn out like I wanted, forget this. And they want to go back to the ivory tower. And Buber kind of says, you know what, no. There has to be that feedback because you take the idea into the world, and he uses this image somewhere that you kind of keep going. You don't know how much of it can be realized until you try. And at a certain point, you hit a wall. You hit your head against the wall of reality, and that's when you know how much of this can be realized right now. But if you don't try, then your idea is useless.
Yeah, when I look at constructive Jewish theologians today, Michael Fishbane or Arthur Green or the like, it seems like it's so this worldly in a way that follows that path, which early theologians didn't have to do. And this combination today, I see many rabbis and academics who view themselves as activists in addition to thinkers, and that need to sort of merge one's activism and theology in a way that makes sense, is coherent, but also has some room for adaptation. Fascinating stuff. Well, thank you very much, Professor Brody. Keep up the wonderful work.
Thank you very much
Check out
for having me.
Theopolitics, Martin Buber's Theopolitics.